Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the pre-launch of Crimean Fig, a collection of contemporary Crimean Tatar poetry and fiction. This marks the first ever English language translation of contemporary Crimean Tatar writings. My name is Natalia Shpilova-Said, and I will be moderating our session today. First and foremost, on behalf of Aerosmith Press, I would like to express our gratitude to the Davis Center at Harvard University for hosting this event, and to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute for co-sponsoring the pre-launch. I would also like to thank our panelists for their support of this publication and for being here to share their insights with us. We will begin with brief opening remarks from Askolt Melnichuk, writer, translator, editor, and founder of both the literary journal Agni and Aerosmith Press. Askolt Melnichuk will also introduce our speakers. Each panelist will offer their reflections with up to 10 minutes for their commentary, and following that, we will open the floor to a Q&A session. And I invite you to submit your questions at any point during the discussion, and I'll bring them to our panelists during the Q&A session. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Askolt Melnichuk, who will offer a few words on Crimean Fig and introduce our speakers.
Thank you so much, Natalia, and thank you to our esteemed panelists. Thank you to those of you watching today. This really is a kind of remarkable coming together of talents on a mission to bring to the world the first ever Anglophone anthology of contemporary Crimean Tatar poetry and fiction. I just want to say a couple of words about how this came about. This project has been in process for nearly 3 years, and it began through a series of interviews I started to do with Ukrainian writers soon after the Russia launched its war on February 22nd in 2022, in part because I was so aware of what had happened to Ukrainian artists and intellectuals during the Stalinist period, and was anxious about a repetition of the same here. And in one of the conversations with the writer I was just getting to know through this conversation, through these Zoom talks, Tatar mentioned the important work of Alim Aliyev, who is here with us today, and his work on introducing contemporary Crimean Tatar poetry and fiction to the world. I then went ahead and had a conversation with Alim, and in the process of our conversation discovered that indeed there had been very little translation of the contemporary work being done by their writers and intellectuals. And this seemed to me, as an editor, kind of a great opportunity to learn. For me, so the project of editing is so much about learning what I don't know, discovering literatures that are significant but overlooked. So this began, as I say, a nearly 3-year-long journey to bring this work together. Through Alim, I got in touch with Anastasia Levkova, who has done such important work in bringing Crimean Tatar poetry and fiction literature to Ukraine itself, and that then helped us to bring it into English through a series of other connections. She gathered materials. The process of gathering materials, I'm hoping Anastasia will speak about, because it turned out to be more intricate and complicated than I had expected, in part because there were a number of writers who, for political reasons, were anxious about appearing and even had their stories and poems removed at the last minute after we had already begun to work with them. Just before I introduce our panelists, I also wanted to say something about the elaborate process of translation that we engaged in. I had the great good fortune of meeting Natalia Shpilova-Said a couple of years ago, and her arrival in Cambridge has done so much to facilitate this, along with many other projects. Truly, with Natalia, we would still be in the hunting and gathering stage without Natalia's diligence and devotion to this, along with so many other projects. So what I had about 30 years ago, I had edited an anthology of contemporary Ukrainian literature by writers of the 1980s, that generation. And my process there was one I replicated here. What I did there was pair Ukrainian translators with young American writers in order to produce as good a version of, as fluent version of the original as possible. There are many theories of translation, and that may be a conversation for another time. But my own sort of mission as an editor was to try to win over as many readers to these not very well-known literatures as possible. And for that, we wanted fluency and a kind of vigor that sometimes precise crib cannot suggest. In that original Ukrainian project, among the young writers I worked with turned out to be two future Pulitzer Prize winners, a National Book Award winner, Joan Palahiri, George Packer, Lloyd Schwartz, and their presence in their collaboration in this project helped to spread the word about the literatures and helped to promote it further beyond our own sort of immediate project. So we did the same with the poems and stories by Crimean Tatars here. We had young writers, as well as a number of established, a couple of the finest fiction writers of a younger generation than mine, look over the very helpful cribs that Anastasia provided us with. She was working with another translator as well, and she'll tell us more about that part of it. And then we had the writers' versions once more gone over by a group of readers, young writers who are working with us at Arrowsmith Press, in order to produce work that we feel will be immediately accessible to an American audience. So that was the way that kind of project went. It's part of the reason it took so long. But here we are on this soft launch. We will have the book available for the world for sale, and we'll have a launch in Cambridge and New York this fall, this October. We hope that you will sign up for pre-orders before the event is out. So now that's really, I would just say, the final thing I'd say is that you will see when you get the book that we put not translated by, but adapted by, because these are in some ways adaptations rather than literal translations. So we want to be accurate about that. So without further ado, I'm now going to introduce our august panelists. And in the order in which they will be speaking, I'll introduce them all at once, and then we'll be able to have a fluent conversation without my interjections. So our first speaker will be Serhiy Plokhy, one of the world's foremost historians of Ukraine and Eastern Europe, as well as director of Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. He's the author of many, many books, among them The Russo-Ukrainian War, The Return of History, Atoms and Ashes, The Global History of Nuclear Disasters, Nuclear Folly, A History of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine. His books have won numerous awards, including the Valley Gifford Award and the Shevchenko National Prize. He'll be followed by Rory Finnan, professor of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Cambridge in the UK. He launched the Cambridge Ukrainian Studies program in 2008. He's curated and organized over 40 exhibitions and cultural events, from the Cambridge Festival of Contemporary Ukrainian Film to the Cambridge Seshvit Literary Evening. They have enriched the understanding of Ukraine's language, history, and society in Great Britain and beyond. His primary research interest is in the interplay of culture and identity in Ukraine. He also focuses on the history of colonialism in Crimea and studies Crimean Tatar literature and culture. His recent book, Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity and the Poetics of Solidarity, has won 8 international awards, earning distinctions in the fields of Ukrainian studies, European studies, Slavic studies, nationalism studies, and genocide studies. He'll be followed by Aleem Aliyev. Aleem is a writer, journalist, and human rights activist. After Russia's occupation of Crimea in 2014, Aleem moved to Kyiv. In 2018, he co-founded the Ukrainian Crimean Tatar Literary Contest and Festival Crimean Fig, from which this anthology draws its name. It's dedicated to the promotion of Crimean Tatar literature and culture in Ukraine and beyond. Aleem serves as a Ukrainian Deputy Director General of the Ukrainian Institute, affiliated with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and co-founder of Crimea SOS. The books he's authored include Mustafa Djemilev, The Unbreakable, about the life of the Crimean Tatar leader. Anastasia Levkova is a writer, journalist, and culture manager and co-founder of the Crimean Fig project. From September 2016 to April 2017, she presented a literary program on Crimean Tatar Hayat Radio titled radio bookstore with Anastasia Levkova. She elaborated the principles for Crimean Fig, the contest of writers and translators, founded in 2018. She's been a coordinator and jury member of the Crimean Fig since 2018. She's also the author of 4 books, including There's a Land Beyond Perekop, a Crimean novel, which I know that Natalia students have been doing versions of, and which will be appearing in the next issue of the Arrowsmith Journal, something to look forward to. And finally, I want to introduce our moderator who will take over from here, Natalia Shpilova-Said, who teaches Ukrainian at Harvard in the Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures. Her primary research interest is in memory studies, particularly contested memory, focusing on Ukraine and Russia. She's an author of a remarkable book, which I've just finished reading, Russia's Denial of Ukraine, Letters and Contested Memory. Her current research project is Russia's Memory of the Past, the War Against Ukraine, and the Forgotten Future. Natalia Shpilova-Said also serves as the H Ukraine review editor and a host on the New Books Network. Natalia, I turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ascolt, and thank you so much for your kind words. And it's been my distinct honor to be part of this project. So we will start with our discussion with a brief talk by Serhiy Plokhy. So in 2014, Crimea attracted international attention after Russia, violating international laws and treaties, occupied the peninsula and declared the territory Russian after conducting a sham referendum. This occupation marked the start of the Russo-Ukrainian War that escalated to a full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And for more than 10 years now, Crimea has been discussed in various contexts. However, more often than not, the main issue was about whether Crimea was Russian or Ukrainian, as if this question could somehow minimize the violation of international laws that Russia conducted, that many would describe as a 19th century land grab. So today, Crimea still remains at the center of international attention. And a few months ago, during one of the talks, you compared the current negotiations regarding Ukraine to the Yalta Conference in 1945. Would you briefly outline Crimea's role in Ukraine's history?
Thank you very much, Natalia, and it's a pleasure to be on this panel. First of all, I'm grateful for inviting me. That made me think about a subject that I didn't think about before, at least didn't think systematically, was not focused on that, and for me it was quite a discovery. So I will be talking about the relations between Ukraine and Crimean Tatars from Ukrainian perspective, which of course leaves open, and it's an open invitation to present the view also from Crimea, from the particular perspective of Crimean Tatars. But what I see from the Ukrainian perspective is quite fascinating and extremely important for Ukraine as such, as who we were, who we are, and even more important of who Ukrainians will be and what Ukraine will look like. First of all, imagine to research, to study, to think about some basic foundations of Ukrainian history, including the state of Kievan Rus, including the exception by the realm as a whole of Christianity in its eastern version from Byzantium. None of that would be possible, or it's possible to imagine it without the Crimea. So the state of Kievan Rus is a byproduct of Vikings' movement toward the Black Sea and Byzantium, and Crimea is right there, and the southern Ukraine is there as well. So that's right as close to the center of Ukrainian history, early Ukrainian history, as one can imagine. If you think about the formation of Ukrainian identity already in early modern period, in early modern times, many historians write about the importance of the steppe frontier, This is Crimea, but also areas north of the Crimea, which one way or another was either part of the Crimean Tatar state or were under the Crimean control. That's the history of the Cossacks. That's the history of important part of Ukrainian mythology. Again, it is there as the result of interaction between Ukraine and, on the one hand, Ukrainians, but also the population of the steppe areas, of the steppe frontier, which Crimea is at the very center of that. If you want to think about the creation of the modern Ukrainian, and in particular early modern Ukrainian state as the result of Khmelnytsky uprising, okay, the spectacular victories of Khmelnytsky would be impossible in 1648 without such minor thing as cavalry. And the Cossacks, despite our imagining Cossacks as someone mounted on the horseback, actually was infantry that was quite effective, was fighting very well, but was incapable of winning major battles or major wars without cavalry. And it was Crimean Tatar cavalry that produced the formation of the early modern state, and Khmelnytsky is right there. So this is, for me, looking at some absolutely key important parts of Ukrainian history, from creation of the medieval state to the Christianity, to the formation of the Cossacks, to the creation of the state of Bogdan Khmelnytsky. And again, you can't just understand that without looking at the Crimea. You can't understand that without looking at Ukraine's relations with the steppe and the Black Sea as a whole. None of that is just straightforward, one-way street. Not all of that is just a happy collaboration and working together. There are huge holes in our knowledge about ourselves, Ukrainians, but also about the region and about Crimea and Crimean Tatars. I'm joining you from Harvard. As already mentioned, I'm the director of the Ukrainian Research Institute, and we are very proud here that the founder of Ukrainian studies here at Harvard, Professor Romelian Pritsak, was a renowned Turkologist and someone who was bringing to the attention the relations with the Ottoman Empire, relations with the Crimea. As far as I know, the first academic article in Ukrainian history is on the alliance between Khmelnytsky and the Crimean Khanate. We very much focused on Europe. I, among others, wrote a book on frontiers of Europe. This is very important politically, but not less important to realize that Ukraine is very much a product of the interrelationship between the settled north and the nomadic south, but also the cultures of the Mediterranean that very much, again, Crimean Tatars were part of that. The autonomous Ukrainian state of early modern period and the Crimean state, which also was a protectorate of the Ottoman Empire, not fully independent, they fall part around and being crushed by the empire, in this particular case, the Russian Empire, around the same time. The Zaporozhian siege, the last hurrah is 1775. Russia destroys it after successful works with the war with the Ottomans, and the Crimean Khanate is actually following the suit within a few short years in 1783. In Ukrainian history, we write a lot, and Shevchenko was writing about that the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth fell and crushed us. We don't normally talk also about the fall of the Crimean Khanate and the impact that had on the history of Ukraine, on the history of the region. We don't talk about also more problematic parts of our relationships. In Ukraine, it's taboo to talk about slavery. because and again, very much part of certainly relations with the steppe, with the Nogais, but also with the Crimean Tatars. We are not going there. We are also not going into the story of settler colonialism, of which, of course, Ukrainians were extremely important part of. So I don't want to present this story of love and support and alliances and cooperation. There was a lot of that, and it was overshadowed by the dominant imperial narratives. But there is also a lot of work for us to do in terms of understanding each other. And we are focused on Europe partially, not only because it's politically important, culturally important, but because we are better equipped, we better understand the Central European history. And we are much less familiar and prepared linguistically, culturally, and otherwise to deal with another very, very important part of our history. And what is happening today, and that's a very important process of, first of all, self-recognition, of recognizing the other, but also understanding the other, which is happening in historically very challenging time, but also very optimistic in many ways times, at least when you look at that historically. Because for a long period of time, the Crimean Tatars and Ukraine and Ukrainians in different incarnations were the outposts of different empires, which were really engaged with each other on their own, but also as agents of those empires. And the understanding between the two groups really started on the basis of what Yohanan Petrovsky-Stern calls this anti-imperial moment and anti-imperial platform, starting with the certainly Helsinki group, and then going from there. One of the members of the Moscow Helsinki group and Ukrainian Helsinki group, of course, General Petro Grigorenko, was right there, and he is a native of southern Ukraine, of Zaporizhzhia Oblast, so very, very close to the Crimea. Ukrainians, again, I'm returning where I started, and that's where I intend to conclude my short remarks. I'm looking at that from the perspective of Ukrainian history, Ukrainian culture, and also future of Ukraine. Ukraine today is in a situation where it still fights for creating and liberating and securing the space for itself and its own culture. But it's also, starting with 1991, is in a unique situation where it has also responsibility for creating and protecting space for other cultures. And this is certainly a challenge, given that both the Ukrainians and the Crimean Tatars for decades and centuries, the main task was actually how to create and protect your own space. And now it's the task and it's the challenge for Ukrainians to protect and create the space for Crimean Tatars and for other groups as well. Crimean Tatars in that way can be a model. It's also for Crimean Tatars a challenge how to manage these relationships where they are and hopefully never will be the sort of hierarchical relationship that define the relation between the empires and imperial cultures. So both groups have to deal with that. But all of that starts certainly with learning as much as possible about each other. And I would say that from Ukrainian perspective, the Crimean Tatars are maybe the most ancient and the closest geographically neighbors and partners and occasionally enemies, but mostly neighbors, about whom Ukrainians know the less. Much less than about Russians, much less than about Poles, much less than about Jews, and the list can go on and on. And literature and translation, that's that's the way to build those bridges. That's the way to deal with that lack of not just understanding often, but knowledge about the other. The politically the platform has been created by patriots and defenders of Ukraine and patriots and defenders of the Crimea as part of Ukraine since 2014 and into today. So those people who are today on the front line, they provide us with chance, with opportunity, with that moment when we can do that. And I really look forward to our today's discussion, and certainly look forward to the reading of the text, reading of the translations. That's what this event is all about. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Serhiy. Thank you so much for your commentary, and I do hope that during our Q&A session we will have an opportunity to delve into some of those aspects that you mentioned. But at this point, I would like to turn it over to Rory Shane. And my brief question will be, how did Crimean Tatar writings survive? And I know that this question cannot be answered concisely. Your book, Blood of Others, Stalin's Crimean Atrocity and the Poetics of Solidarity, is arguably the first profound attempt in Anglophone scholarship to fix the blunder of omitting the Crimean Tatars when conversations focus on Crimea. It also highlights not only the complex and entangled history of the peninsula where the Russian, Ukrainian, and Turkish influences meet and collide, but also the plight that Crimean Tatars had endured for centuries. You bring attention to the Crimean Tatar Vatan homeland that goes through the cycles of displacement, expulsion, and resistance. And your book consists of 3 chapters that detail the story of a stolen homeland and a painful return to the land ravaged by colonizers, tyrants, as well as collaborators and bystanders. And those 3 parts are possession, dispossession, and repossession. To recover the voices of Crimean Tatars from the silence imposed by both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, you approached the culture that was on the cusp of extinction from the standpoint of political guilt and responsibility, cultural diversity and interconnectedness, and the ethics of empathy and solidarity. So as this brief overview of your book shows, my question cannot be answered just in a few words, but at least maybe you can give us this overall view of how Crimean Tatar writings did survive in spite of the fact that the Crimean Tatars had to overcome so many hardships and so many difficulties.
Natalia, thank you so much for such a provocative and important question. Thank you for the privilege of being here. It's a great honor to be with all of you. I'm particularly excited about the emergence of this very important book, which I've had the honor of seeing and reading. And it is a tribute to the organizers, Anastasia, Alim, for what they've achieved with this important project. And I'm hopeful that we will see more and more Crimean Tatar language literature in English translation. It's very exciting. As you said, Natalia, to talk about a few centuries of Crimean Tatar literature in a few minutes is always a bit tricky. So what I'd like to do today is, first of all, share an image with you and begin our discussion with it. Bear with me just for one moment while I find it. Here we go. Hope everyone can see the screen here. Let me know if you don't. So yes, Crimean Tatar literature is rich, it's dynamic, it's diverse. And so what I want to do today in discussing this question of survival, Natalia, is to address, let's say, 3 key highlights that are inspired by an image. And this is the image here. On the face of it, it might not seem a typical place to begin because, after all, it's a vision, an allegory of Catherine's journey to Crimea by Ferdinand de Maes, a widely copied painting that presents Catherine's journey through Ukraine to Crimea in 1787 as this odyssey of triumph an Odyssey of splendor. So she is personified here as an empire on the march. It's quite a painting. If you look at the upper right in the sky, you'll see alongside Neptune, there's Peter looking down on Catherine approvingly. But I want us to pay attention to the Crimean Tatar woman at the center of the canvas. So you'll see her resplendent in this, this traditional marama veil. And you'll see here among all these various anonymous imperial subjects. It's important for us to remember that at the time of Catherine's journey to Crimea in 1787, virtually the entire population was ethnically Crimean Tatar. So this woman here is presented very much as a kind of instrument of imperial mystification. Because as we know from the memoirs of Catherine's French travel companions, Catherine's arrival in Bakhchisarai, for instance, did not elicit this kind of reaction. It did not elicit the expected wonder among local residents. In fact, one of her French sources takes pains to note that Crimean Tatars averted their gaze and even turned their back on her procession. One of them says it this way, quote, "They preserve their stupid pride even when they are conquered," unquote. So today I want to spend a little time foregrounding some texts that survive by employing the same tactic. That is, they turn their backs on imperial power. So this painting is an allegory. In here I want to pick up on a number of things that Professor Polhi said and pointed out. And that is a kind of critique, really, of our academic work that has participated in a kind of epistemic suffocation of voices, perspectives, of resistance from imperial power. And these voices we shouldn't romanticize, as he pointed out, I think, very persuasively. But we might say that Western scholarship is and has been complicit in this silencing for too long. And it's, I think, a tribute to Harvard. And I think I need to say this these days when Harvard itself is threatened and is resisting, that it's a tribute to the university that and the Davis Center for hosting this session today. But in most Western histories of the Russian Empire, we simply don't hear of this defiant reception of Catherine among Crimean Tatar communities. We don't address the fact that Crimea invaded the Crimean Tatar Khanate 4 times before conquering it. We tend to present, for instance, this annexation in 1783 as this seamless expansion of imperial power, but it's an illusion. So important for us to take stock of the interventions here by the Russian Empire in Crimea in the late 18th century. The population, even after the Crimean War in the 1850s, was very dominantly Crimean Tatar. In the 1850s, they constituted around 80% of Crimea's inhabitants. By 1900, though, they plummeted to roughly 25% of the population, and this has everything to do with what Professor Polhi mentioned earlier, and that is settler colonialism that scholars of the Russian Empire and of this region in the West have, I think, failed to note frequently or as vocally as we should have. And that was settler colonialism that displaced forcibly Crimean Tatars from their homeland in successive waves. So the voices of these Crimean Tatar displaced are many. And they are sufficiently loud, but in Slavic studies we tend not to hear them because they don't really appear in Russian or Ukrainian sources. Instead, we tend to find them often in Ottoman and modern Turkish sources. And so here I just want to give you an example from the Istanbul-based journal Emel from 1970. This is an excerpt from a folk song of the Türkü genre, in which rhyme is conveyed according to this AAB scheme by way of suffixes. So in this case, you'll hear the suffix mas repeated over and over again with a very poignant refrain at the end of the quatrain. Bir yanımızı Moskov sardı kaçılmaz. Bir yanımızı kara derya aşılmaz. Mevlam kenat vermeyince uçulmaz. Fena müşkül oldu halı Kırım'ın. So today I want to focus on a few Crimean Tatar figures, some who remain in Crimea, some who are indeed displaced after the deportation of the Crimean Tatars in 1944. But these are all figures who effectively turn their backs to Russian imperial power, as those did in 1787. That is, they fight back and they disrupt and unsettle Russian colonialist discourses by effectively ignoring them. And here I think it's important for us to underscore the contributions that Crimean Fig as a volume offer us as an intellectual, as an artistic text and event. It is that they map new itineraries of artistic and political possibilities outside of the Kremlin's imperialist imaginary. So when we focus on Crimean Tatar literature, we're outside very often of the Kremlin's imperialist imaginary. And I think this approach to studying Crimean Tatar voices offers us a methodology of decolonization that we very much find urgent today. So one of the first voices I want to call upon here in this narrative of survival is the work of Hüseyin Shamil Toktargazi, who was an educator, an activist, a poet of the fin de siècle period. And in his poetry, every stanza is a vehicle to answer one question. And the question is, who are the Crimean Tatars? He answers it in a variety of ways. Toktargazi was born not too far from Bakhchisarai in this village of Kukuz, whose beauty inspired many 19th century landscape artists like Carlo Bossoli, which you can see here. Toktargazi was very much an autodidact, so his father passed away at an early age. He had to support his family by working, but nonetheless, in his free time, very much like Shevchenko, indeed, he tried his hands at poems. And so his literary skills at the very beginning weren't regarded very positively as sophisticated, but what he lacked in finesse, he made up for in force. And this force was poetical and political. As the Ukrainian polymath Ahat Krimsky notes in 1930, Toktargazi injected the Crimean Tatar national idea with this unprecedented creative energy. And he did so by asserting what's really important for us to understand here in the context of the Crimean Fig volume. And that is, he did so by asserting a deep bond between Crimean Tatar territory and Crimean Tatar culture. And here I'm using the term Crimean Tatar consciously. Increasingly, it's accepted to use the term Kurumli. So I'm using Crimean Tatar for a number of reasons that connect the term with past scholarship on Crimean Tatar history and culture. But Toktargazi has this verse that heaves with exclamations of this bond between Crimean territory and Tatar culture. But he also invests it with spiritual significance, suggesting that there are religious obligations due to the homeland here too. He was very satirical at times. His poetry could critique fellow Crimean Tatars for an abuse of the imperial system for material gain. So he has a poem called Para, Money, in which he ridicules fellow Crimean Tatars who simply begin to worship wealth and advancement in the imperial system. He also wrote a very important satirical play that critiqued the abuses of society by mullahs and other Muslim clerics in Crimea. So this activism brought controversy. The controversy endangered his life. And in fact, in 1913, conservative Crimean Tatar elites accused his poems of doing great damage to Crimean Tatar society, and he was, in fact, killed by them. So this murder becomes very central to another work that speaks to this narrative of survival, and it is the most important Crimean Tatar novel of the 20th century, entitled Iblisnin Ziafeten et Davet, or the Invitation to the Feast of the Devil, which is written by another figure of the 20th century, rather, who's important for us to know today as well. He's often considered the En Parlak Yıldız, the shining star, the most bright star of Crimean Tatar prose and indeed poetry in his early career, and that's Shamil Al-Yadin. So Al-Yadin is exiled to Uzbekistan after the Second World War, after Stalin's deportation. He, in fact, came back to Crimea after the retreat of the Nazis, only to find that his daughter and wife had been swept up in the deportation. He himself had served heroically on the front. So Al-Yadin seizes on Toktargazi as a message for 20th century Crimean Tatar society. I don't have time to talk too much about this novel, but it's hugely important, and I hope we'll see it in English translation someday, because it gives us a Crimean Tatar Crimea of the 19th century in fulsome detail, in really vibrant color as well. And to give you a sense of this, I wanted to highlight a particular sentence. It's a very long sentence here, but it shows us a Crimea against these bustling markets, ivy-covered minarets. Ali-ad-Din seizes on this historical personage of Tokhtar Ghazi, creates a kind of fictionalized character around him, and positions him across different places in Crimean Tatar society at the twilight of the Russian Empire. And what's important about this novel is that Russians do not figure anywhere very centrally. Mikhailo Kotyubinsky, the great Ukrainian prose stylist, pops in here and there in various cafes in Ali-ad-Din's rendering of Crimea. But for the most part, this is a very vibrant portrayal of a Crimean Tatar Crimea in the Crimean Tatar language, about a Crimean Tatar historical figure who is agitating for his people against all odds. So it is a very potentially radioactive novel. And Ali-ad-Din actually employs a number of literary tropes to protect himself. But we can see in a number of instances in the novel how deeply vibrant this Bakhchisarai and Crimean Tatar Crimea are. We see a capital that is this bustling ecosystem with discussions, debates, corruption. We have this really complex human and built environment that is demonstrably Crimean Tatar presented here in this novel. So in this particular sentence that begins, and I won't read the entire thing because I think it will take the full 8 minutes that I have, well, a couple of minutes that I have left. On altı bin adımlık iyilige sahip bu şiirinin 32 malısında, 32 camisi, 32 yüksek acayip minaresi. We see here many different attributes and buildings, monuments that are being listed here in great detail. That Bakhchisarai here is not some sleepy town, but a very bustling place. And so Crimean Tatar literature survives over this period, often by strategically ignoring Russian culture, Russian imperial discourse, instead focusing on their own history, trying to return the contemporary reader, whether it's in the Soviet period, after 1991 even, to a Crimea that exists due to their leadership, their sovereignty, the depth of their culture. And so it's important for us to focus on these stories and these voices because they open us a window into a world of centuries, of dreams, aspirations, and imaginings of the people who I think, like the Karayim, like the Krimchak, who are intimately connected to the Black Sea and to Crimea, but whose voices we've neglected for far too long. So I'll conclude there. I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much, Rory. Thank you so much again for your detailed research. And I really appreciate your reading a few lines in the Crimean Tatar language. As one of our translators mentioned, it was very important for our contributors to keep what she described as the local color. And we paid a lot of attention to that request, and we tried to keep a couple of sentences and some words in the Crimean Tatar language so that it amplified the atmosphere on the one hand, but on the other hand also introduced the Crimean Tatar language to our readers. And as you pointed out in your commentary, well, hopefully more translations will be done into English, but I also hope that it will be some incentive to introduce Crimean Tatar language programs in higher education institutions outside Ukraine as well. Well, thank you so much. And then we will have our next speaker, Alim Aliyev. Alim, I had this pleasure to speak with you a couple of months ago, and our conversation was about this anthology as well. My questions are some sort of a follow-up on that conversation to some extent. So how would you describe the contemporary potential to exercise, if possible and when possible, the right to resist and deliver one's voice in Crimea? What sustains that endeavor, and what literary and artistic manifestations are embraced? In your foreword included in this book, you mentioned that Crimea hasn't been, unfortunately, known for the Crimean Tatar language, for Crimean Tatar literature and culture. Instead, the reputation was tied to either Russian or Soviet presence, and the former included famous Russian literature figures visiting the peninsula, and the latter, in addition to historical events that took place in the peninsula, to summer resorts. And that kind of reputation contributed to this exoticization of not only peninsula, but of the entire culture as well. So I asked this question partially because of what I mentioned before, these questions, whether anything changed, particularly on the international level in terms of how Crimea is known today, of course, outside this ongoing conversation whether Crimea is Russian or Ukrainian.
Yeah, thank you, Natalia. Assalamu alaikum, sayın dostlar. Good afternoon, dear friends. It's a pleasure to talk today to you. And to be honest, today is a historical day because it's a really first English version of contemporary Crimean Tatar literature, Crimean Tatar fiction, and poems. I want to thank to Askold Melnichuk, to Natalia, to you. I want to thank to my partner in crime, Anastasia Levkova, co-founder of Crimean Fig project, and I want to also to thank for Elena Novokhatska, our project manager, and our jury members, Andrei Kurkov, Maya Safet, Bekir Mahmoud, Katerina Kalitko, Ivan Andrusak, Jamilia Suleiman. All of them are prominent Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar writers, poets, literature managers, and experts. And also, first of all, I want to thank for all of our authors who sent their own works to Crimean Fig. I will start from 90s, and I will start from the period when a new literary renaissance began as Crimean Tatars returned from exile to Crimea, which coincided with the early years of Ukrainian independence. For example, my family back to Crimea in 1989, and mostly Crimean Tatars back to Crimea in the late of 18th and early 19th. And poets, writers, and journalists who came back to their homeland, hosted literary events, actively contributed to the social and political life on the peninsula, and freely published and distribute large print runs of newspapers and magazines that had circulated underground during the Soviet times. And the establishment of national schools, libraries, theater, university, and media, it gives a push of a literary process, offering it practical platforms. For example, authors continue to send their text to the newspaper Taram, Yana Dunya, Avdet, and Yildiz magazine that established in Soviet times. At least 2 departments for the study of Crimean Tatar language and literature were established in Crimean universities. But Russia's temporary occupation of Crimea disrupted this process, yet again treating the very existence of Crimean Tatar identity and subjecting public life on the peninsula to censorship. Literature has become a tiny island of freedom where authors sometimes writing under pseudonyms raise the issues of temporary occupation and its consequences. Another important phenomenon is literature gatherings where authors read their text and where only our own people are present. This format is justified by the fact that in the occupied Crimea, there is an atmosphere of distrust, of mistrust, and fear. So only proven people are welcome at such events. Also, it is important to emphasize that along with the literary festival Crimean Fig in Kyiv, a Crimean Tatar book fair is held in Crimea, where a great emphasis is placed on the children's program. This is due to the fact that the occupation of Crimea for Crimean Tatars is a new colonization, and Rory described a lot about this years and years of colonization of Crimea by Russian. It means for us, it's of trying of a new try of destroying national identity. And therefore, it's precisely educational work with the children, the publication of books in native language for them, that is the antidote to this process. By the way, for example, Crimean Tatar language, one of the endangered language according to UNESCO list. And today we really have one of the biggest challenge for Crimean Tatars is to preserve Crimean Tatar language. That's why parents gather their own children at homes and teach language. And it's one of the form of resistance as for me. And if we talk about the form of literature, the short prose and poetry prevail. Thematically, I would highlight a few blocks. Yeah, first block, it's a plot related of the theme of genocide of Crimean Tatar people, the deportation of 1944. Often, it's about of people who have lost loved ones, about life in exile in Uzbekistan, in Kyrgyzstan, in another place of Central Asia and Siberia. And also, of course, the momentum of return to Crimea. And this anthology will also contain several such texts. Second, in poetry, first of all, in poetry, the terms intangible civil lyrics, experiences of occupation, repression, divorce, and this tragic change. And what's important to say is that metaphorical techniques are often used here. One more, it's about historical literature, and historical literature taking a special place. Today, we are decolonizing knowledge about ourselves. And the peninsula, we will talk about the history of peninsula from our perspective. I say that, we are living the period when we are reclaiming our names. And for Crimean Tatars, it's important also to do. That's why we have a few historians, not much, and I hope that in the future we'll have much more historians, as Gulnara Bekirova, Gulnara Abdullaeva, Hakan Karamlı, who cover this topic of different periods of Crimean history. And I'm glad that Crimean Tatar literature has more and more diverse genres. Novels, fantasy, mysticism, detective stories. And very important to say is that our authors are both in Crimea and outside of Crimea. A new genre literature from behind bars has also emerged. You know, as in Soviet times, we have such genre as literature from prison. Unfortunately, today we have also the literature from our political prisoners. Sent by Russia under fabricate charged poetry and prose from their cells in Russian and Crimean prisons. This whole tapestry of text is published in the Crimean Fig anthologies. Our contributors include illegally imprisoned Server Mustafayev, Hassan Akhtem, Osman Arif Mehmetov, Vadim Seruk, and Mumia Saliyeva, the wife of political prisoner Server Saliyev. Among our authors is also Nariman Jalal, a prominent public and political figure, journalist, and first deputy head of the Majlis of Crimean Tatar people. And Nariman was illegally sentenced by a Russian regime in September 2021 and liberated in June last year. Yeah. And Crimean Fig and contemporary Crimean Tatar literature as a whole an effective antidote for the Kremlin imperial effort to forcibly integrate Crimea into the destructive Russian world. You know, but on the core topic of many Crimean Tatar authors, it's of course Crimea. And in the end of my speech, I just tried to quotate the text, the poem by one of the jury, our members, prominent Crimean Tatar poet and translator Maya Safet, that these poems swarming published in our anthology. I will read in Crimean Tatar. I will try to read in Crimean Tatar language and Ukraine and English version also. O zenlerde suğa tolup, taşıp çapa denizge, haber ete herkeske, bar keldi Kırım'a. Unut eski dörtlerini, bak etrafka, em kuvan. Ne de güzel yurtumuz, mukaddes Kırım vatan. Forget your worries. Go out and catch the wind. Get dizzy. Train your eyes to love everything. Savor the mild air, thrilling there. So beautiful is our homeland. So holy is Crimea, our motherland. And at the end, I will say that for all of Crimean Tatars, it's important, of course, to back to Crimea and hope that next versions of Crimean Fig and another literature projects and literature books will present in our Free Crimea. Thank you. Savons.
Thank you so much, Alim. I'm happy that you underlined that this book is about Crimea by Crimean Tatar voices. And I'm also happy that you underlined some topics and some themes, motives that actually are included in this anthology as well. And I hope we will be able to talk about this in more detail. But yes, indeed, there are some ways in which our contributors were able to talk about their life under occupation without actually overtly and openly talking and describing the situation. And I think it's one of those interesting things that could be of interest to our researchers in the future, for instance, to study how the individuals, right, how people survive that kind of occupation and preserve their identity and develop it further. Thank you so much for your comments. And our next speaker is Anastasia Levkova. Of course, Anastasia, I can but mention your novel, There is a Land Beyond Perekop, that, among other things, delivers an entangled history, including Ukrainian, Crimean Tatar, and Russian contexts. The Russian context has an unambiguously dominant status initially, but it is made to recede as the Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar contexts make themselves more prominent. In my opinion, it's a story of decolonization, but it doesn't have any kind of pathos. Instead, it's a very intimate story of a woman that reflects on her journey of understanding, to put it simply, what it is that makes her revolt against the Russian dominant. And in a word, I would say that this novel is a novel about a sense of human dignity. Well, thank you so much for this novel, and I would like you to talk a little bit more about the literary project Crimean Fig, for which you are a co-founder and a coordinator.
Thank you so much, Natalia, for the question and for your mentioning about my novel, but certainly today I'll talk about the Crimean Fig literary contest. First of all, I want to say thanks a lot to the organizers of the event for the idea of this project, for bringing it to life, and for inviting me to participate in it, and as well as in the presentation. So I will talk about the Crimean Fig literary contest, which Alim Aliyev and I conceived in 2018. And thanks to Alim's energy and efforts, it was held for the first time that same year in 2018. So I'll share a presentation. I hope you see it. Yes. So what is Crimean Fig? Actually, I say contest, but it is not just a contest. It has become a whole ecosystem. It includes the contest itself, a literary festival, and the publication of anthologies. The Crimean Fig. These anthologies feature the works of the contest participants. To date, 4 such anthologies, such books in Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar have been published, and this year we are expecting the 5th one. When we established the contest, we realized that in order to foster mutual understanding and a kind of mental integration of Crimea, it is important to enrich Ukrainian literature with works about Crimea and also to encourage Crimean Tatar authors to write. Sorry, I'll... Yes. Do you see project goals? Yeah. Okay. And we must understand that the Crimean Tatar language is the language in danger. It was listed by UNESCO in the Atlas of the World's Languages in Danger. Of course, a single contest cannot replace the complex factors that influence language usage, such as education, public and media use. But firstly, by this contest, by this ecosystem, the Crimean Fig, we encourage people who know Crimean Tatar, who can write, to write. And secondly, we allow readers to access works in this language, and also we promote mutual translations. I will mention the categories of the Crimean Fig contest. Not firstly, but you see, it's prose in Ukrainian, about Crimea, prose in Crimean Tatar, no topic restrictions, poetry in Ukrainian about Crimea, poetry in Crimean Tatar, no topic restrictions, children's literature in Ukrainian about Crimea and in Crimean Tatar on any topic, translation from Ukrainian to Crimean Tatar and and vice versa, from Crimean Tatar to Ukrainian. Last year, we created a new category, essays in Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar. A very important category and a special award is works of freedom. Every year we receive works from Crimean political prisoners passed to us from Russian prisons through their lawyers. And I remind to the audience that since 2014, there have been 318 for today, to the date, 318 political prisoners from Crimea in Russian prisons. 216 of them are Crimean Tatars, so more than a half. And another category of our contest is for a contribution to Crimean Tatar literature, awarded to a respected author whose body of work the jury deems outstanding. On this slide, you see the statistics. I won't list it orally. You see it. But I want to emphasize that over the years of the contest's existence, people from all regions of Ukraine have participated, including, of course, the occupied territories, especially Crimea. Participants have also included Ukrainians living abroad in Germany, Estonia, Turkey, and other countries. Importantly, during the development of the Crimean Fig project, we have seen not only new works that would not have existed without the contest, but we also saw the emergence of translators from Ukrainian into Crimean Tatar and vice versa. For example, the Ukrainian poet Inessa Dolenik, who would never have studied the Crimean Tatar language or translated classical and contemporary Crimean Tatar authors if not for this contest. Every year, Inessa Dolenik enters with new translations and either wins or makes it to the finals. Regarding the importance of translation, I recall the speech of this year's winner in the category translation from Ukrainian to Crimean Tatar, Mamure Chabanova. She said that she is often asked why she translates from Ukrainian into Crimean Tatar, since all Crimean Tatars can read works in Ukrainian. At that point of her speech, Mamure began to cry, and I, sitting in the audience, cried with her. Mamure continued, works are translated not only to make them accessible to a certain group of readers, but also to develop the target language itself. In a language that is not in active use, not spoken by the youth, not used in universities, except in philology departments, entire layers of vocabulary may be missing. Slang, profanity, terminology, words for new phenomena, and so on. And it is precisely during the process of translation that translators look for equivalence, either in the history of the language among archaic words or by inventing new ones. I'll show you the list of authors who were translated for this contest. Some of their works have been translated due to the contest. Due to the Crimean Fig, Ukrainian writing about Crimea has also changed. Its narratives have evolved. In the past, Ukrainians, here I mean also our classical literature, like Михайло Коцюбинський, Леся Українка, Максим Рильський, Микола Зеров. They wrote about Crimea either as a Soviet resort, but not mentioned, not mentioned authors, or mentioned authors as an exotic land inhabited by an interesting but foreign Crimean Tatar people. Thanks to the Fig, many works now depict Crimea from the inside, even when written by mainland authors. For example, the contest led to the emergence of remarkable works written by Ukrainians about the deportation of 1944 and other chapters of the Crimean Tatar history. Here I mean, for example, a small novel by Natalia Smirnova, Sardiye means happy. It is evident that the contest encouraged Ukrainian authors who wrote on these topics to delve deeper into the history of the Crimean Tatars. Usually literary contests are perceived as a means to select the best works. But more often, their purpose is not just to identify good works, but to create a demand for works on certain topics or in certain genres. In this context, I often recall the novel by the classic of Crimean Tatar literature, Shamil al-Din, already mentioned by Professor Finin, Invitation to the Devil's Banquet, already mentioned, which features a dialogue between the publisher Ismail Gasprinsky and the poet Hussein Shamil Tokhtarghazi, already mentioned by Professor Finin. Both are historical figures, classics of Crimean Tatar literature. And Hussein Shamil Tokhtarghazi, in this dialogue, in this novel by Shamil al-Din, tells Ismail Gasprinsky, if we, poets, did not exist, you would have nothing to print. To which the publisher replies, if there were no newspaper, you would have nowhere to publish your works. And although the poet's words seem logical, in this case, I'm firmly on Gasprinsky's side, because often it is the platforms that encourage authors to create texts that allow literature to be made. Speaking more broadly, the Crimean Fig contest has established connections between Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian writers, translators, editors, and publishers. Unfortunately, this connection did not exist before the Russian occupation, before 2014. At our events before the full-scale invasion in 2022, when we could still bring people from Crimea to Kiev, to Lviv, there was communication, sharing of experience and ideas between Ukrainian and Crimean Tatar writers and translators and editors. And if we are presenting an anthology of Crimean Tatar works translated into English and published in America today, this means that the Crimean Fig has become a gateway for Crimean Tatar literature to enter the world beyond Ukraine. Thanks a lot for the invitation and for your attention.
Thank you so much, Anastasia. I think you can stop sharing your screen at this point. I believe we have a little bit more than 10 minutes for our Q&A session. And we have a couple of questions in our Q&A box. I will read these questions. So one of the first questions is about the classes of the Kyrillic language in Ukrainian elementary school. Tatiana Zedevich mentions that there was a conversation about introducing these classes in the past. Has this initiative been developed? And the connected question to this is, are Kyrillic authors incorporated into Ukrainian school curriculum? So maybe it's a question to Alim.
Yeah, thank you. I will start and maybe some of our colleagues will continue. Yeah, I just read these questions about education and Latin, also alphabet, and so on, so on. We should say that today we have a situation where we can develop Crimean Tatar language, unfortunately, only outside of Crimea, in mainland of Ukraine. And that's why it's responsible both of Crimean Tatar community and Crimean Tatar people and Ukrainian state. Because as all of us mentioned, today is the main challenge is to preserve the language. As you know, Ukrainian state, Ukrainian government adopted the law and the strategy of development of Crimean Tatar language, and a week ago adopted the Latin alphabet of Crimean Tatar language. But we should say that mostly the audience who are reading and writing on Crimean Tatar language are in Crimea. And it's today that why our homework and our task is to develop online programs, first of all for children, books for children to learn the mother tongue. And if we talk about Crimea, I said that I will lie if I say that in Crimea schools we have any Crimean Tatar language. We have Crimean Tatar language, but it's the language, the lessons that you can learn after 3 p.m. as a Ukrainian language, as a variety of different subjects. It means that the task of parents is to develop this home courses of languages in Crimea. And also, I will say a lot of thanks for organizers and for activists in Crimea, inside of Crimea, who published Crimean Tatar books for children and who presented literature evenings, so-called literature evenings, literature night to be correct, and who organized book fairs to make more popular not only the books, but firstly not the books, popular Crimean Tatar language. And last, that I forgot to say before, I want to just mention the authors who will be a part of our anthology. I think it's important to name them. In fiction part is Mustafa Ahmed, Zikiye Ismailova, Elmira Bekirova, and Zera Bekirova. In poetry part, Zulbiya Satarova, Maya Safet, Seria Kokche, Aliye Kinjali. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Alim. And there is another question asked by Tatiana Dedevich about Anastasia's novel to be translated into English. As Askolt Melnichuk already mentioned at the beginning, 2 of my students who study Ukrainian decided to translate a very brief excerpt from your novel, and hopefully that excerpt will be soon published in the Aerosmith Journal. But in terms of this possibility to translate the entire novel, I do hope that this translation will appear quite soon, because I think the book itself speaks to that point that Serhiy Plokhy mentioned in his comments about this possibility, right? Possibility to engage critically with the history of Ukrainians and Crimean Tatars, and not to turn it into some love story, but to really show and reveal all the complexities. And I think Anastasia's novel is an excellent example of that very entangled and very complex story that really shows the pains as well as that solidarity endeavor as well. There is another question by Dominique Hoffman, and this question is for you, Rory. Professor Finian mentioned the choice between use of terms Crimean Tatar versus Kremli in English. Could you speak a bit more about current thinking about this question with the Ukraine and beyond?
Thanks to Dominique for the question. And I'd like to also say that Anastasia's book is, by my lights, one of the best Ukrainian novels of the past 2 to 3 decades. And I really can't wait for it to be published in English. As to this question of the ethnonym, so obviously, of course, this is something that I would want to leave to Crimean Tatar colleagues. I think there's a really interesting discussion to be had about connections of the ethnonym to past scholarship and past references to this indigenous people of Ukraine, of Crimea. There is, I think, value sometimes in using the term Crimean Tatar because it allows readers, students to access information about Crimean Tatar history and culture that's already been published, and they'll have that ethnonym in hand, and it'll be consistently used. However, the term itself, Crimean Tatar, is there are quite literally centuries of debates and contests over the name itself. Anastasia mentioned Ismail Bey Gasparale or Gasparinsky. He himself didn't like the term Crimean Tatar because he thought it was too in touch with this, let's say, Russian pejorative word. So even in Turkey today, for instance, you will encounter the term Kırım Türkleri, Crimean Turks. So there's a lot of contestation. So it depends, I think, on the purpose of the ethnonym. If we are trying to connect it to a history, particularly of the early 21st and 20th centuries, if we want to make sure that the peoples that have been read about in the New York Times after 2014 are connected to the Crimean Tatars today, I think it's worth using that term. At the same time, Kırımlı offers a new generation of Crimean Tatars a fresh mode of identification. And obviously, we would always defer to what those generations would wish to identify with.
Thank you, Rory. And Romana Hook also asked Serhiy Plokhy to contribute to this terminology question as well, if possible.
Yeah. Again, it's the question again. It's that there is a lot of history to it, as Professor Finin was just talking about, and it comes also with a lot of confusion because the term Tatar has a long history of its own and has been applied to different categories of ethnic groups and also polities. The word Tatar is associated, at least in the Russian narrative, very close with the Mongol conquest. And in that sense, that's why when the term Tatar is used, the Crimean Tatars is so important. So you automatically use two words, right? So Tatar is considered to be a more broader category with a bigger set of issues, historical and otherwise. So I look at the turn toward one term, Kremlin in particular, as a positive development. The trick is how in that story is not to lose the familiarity of the readership with the group that was identified as Crimean Tatars. how not to lose connection with the history and historical sources that refer to that category, and to a degree to identity that also it created among the group itself. Again, this is a difficult challenge, but it's not particularly unique or unresolvable if you look at that from the history of Ukraine. Mikhailo Hrushevsky was struggling to put together the terms Rus and Ukraine, and eventually came up with the 10-volume history of Ukraine Rus, with Rus again being very confusing because it actually the threat was that Ukrainian individual history would be lost in the history of Russia or differently understood Rusis. So the Crimean Tatars are in the same category, and it was a period of time when transition was happening between Rus and Ukraine and how to become Ukraine without losing Rus. So my general approach to that is, okay, that's something very important, something to think about. But more than anything else, okay, welcome to the club.
Thank you.
Ukrainians have been dealing with the same sort of questions and issues already for a while.
Thank you. There are two questions pertaining to translation and publication process, and maybe Askolt, you could address those. Tatiana Mandyuk asks, how many translators work on the anthology? And Chenny Crow asks if the anthology can be purchased at this point, and if there is a link that one can follow.
Thank you for those important questions. The anthology is not yet available to be purchased. It'll be available late this summer in advance of an October publication date. But that's the previous question fits in perfectly to something I wanted to mention that came up in various ways in all the speakers' presentations. And that was just an idea of interdependence. Anastasia spoke about the interdependence of authors on newspapers and the way in which they were required. You needed to have a vehicle to put the word out. And that he spoke about the ways in which the Crimean Tatar story changes some of the Ukrainian narrative and enlarges that story. I think everything Rory spoke about suggested the complex interdependence of histories of various cultures and empires. And Alim, your bringing in the names of the writers was so important and valuable. I want to say something that Arrowsmith Press is named in honor of an old colleague from my days at Boston University. He was the great classics translator. William Arrowsmith was also the translator of the Italian poets Virginia Montale and Leopardi. And we had the privilege, when I was editing Agni, of publishing a number of Bill Arrowsmith's translations of Montale in the journal, and we presented in the way that the work of translators used to be presented, with the writer's name at the top and the running heads at the top of the page, and the translator's name in small print at the very end of the translation. And I received an angry, full single-spaced page letter from the translator Bill Arrowsmith, chastising me for how dare I demean the work of the translator. Without the translator's work, we would never know the original. It is the intermediary. So it is this kind of elaborate and intricate process of interdependence that I think is, after all, at the core of our kind of human condition. We had many translators working here, and I wish I had the time to name them all. They included poets like him. But if I start naming one, I have to name all, and I will regret forgetting someone under these circumstances. But what I want to say at the end here is that I hope that this is just the beginning of a very important conversation. I've learned so much from listening to you all, and I continue to want to learn much more and understand more and see how this can develop. So I want to say that we are planning to have several events to launch the book in the fall, including something at the Shevchenko Scientific Society in New York, and then at different venues around town in Boston and in New York, where we will be bringing in some of the translators and collaborators with the translators. And in some cases, I hope that we'll be able to reprise some of this conversation with the current speakers here. Perhaps some of you will be in the States at some point, if we can do it in person. If not, we will do it online. so that we can, again, continue to deepen this conversation and engage a wider and ever widening audience. I thank you so very much for all your work and your contributions to this project, and may it be just the start of a beautiful friendship.
Well, thank you so much. We ran out of our time, and I just want to say thank you again to all our panelists and for sharing your insights. And thank you to the Davis Center and to the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute for hosting and sponsoring this event. And as Askold mentioned, I do hope that this conversation is just one of many dedicated to Crimea and Crimean Tatar literature and culture. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all our audiences for joining us today in the afternoon.